I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are on the unceded ancestral lands of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people, for whom we are grateful that it's where Simon Fraser University resides. Welcome to the Conference on Indigenous Struggles and the Ideology of Development. This is the third meeting of the conference, the panel on Latin America. My name is Ian Angus. I'm Professor Emeritus from Simon Fraser University and specifically the Department of Humanities. I'd just like to begin by saying that this conference was organized by Chin Banerjee. It's called the Conference on Indigenous Struggles and the Ideology of Development. It was organized by Chinmoy Banerjee, who was a professor in the English department and then Professor Emeritus at Simon Fraser University. Organized for the South Asian Network for Secularism and Democracy, SANSAD, and is co-sponsored by the SFU's Institute for the Humanities, the Harry Sharma Foundation, the David Lamb Center for International Communication, the School for International Studies, the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Simon Fraser University, and is supported by the Vancouver Democracy Alliance. When Chin asked me early this year to chair this session, I couldn't refuse. Not that I wanted to refuse, but when Chin asked, he was a persuasive asker, also, I've admired Chin Banerjee since the 1980s, when he was very active in co-founding the BC Organization to Fight Racism, a very important organization in the 1980s. So since he has sadly left this world now, the Institute for the Humanities took over the logistics for the conference, but it was all organized by Chin in his last months. I think it's a wonderful tribute to him that these are the things that were on his mind at the last months of his life. And I think that the conference can stand as a tribute to his activism and his passions. We have tonight a speaker, Lynn Stephen from the University of Oregon, and then a response by Gerardo Otero from International Studies at Simon Fraser University. I'll introduce people just before they speak. Excuse me. And then I should say, as moderator, I'm going to check the chat and the question and answers, and I will read out questions for discussion so that everybody can hear the questions before they're responded to. Lynn Stephen is Philip H. Knight Chair and Distinguished Professor of Arts and Sciences, Professor of Anthropology, and a participating faculty member in Indigenous Race and Ethnic Studies, Latin American Studies, and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University of Oregon. She founded the Center for Latino, Latina, and Latin American Studies and served as director of it for 9 years. Lynn's scholarly work centers on the impact of globalization, migration, nationalism, and the politics of culture on indigenous communities in the Americas. She engages with political economy, ethnohistory, and ethnography to create a hemispheric lens on major challenges faced by indigenous peoples and others, outmigration, tourism, economic development, etc., and specifically their creative responses to these challenges of our time. Lynn Stephen will speak on decolonizing development, insights from Indigenous and other women. Take it away, Lynn.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, I want to thank the Institute for the Humanities for the invitation. Thanks to Huyen for helping with the logistics. She's still doing it behind the scenes, Ian, and to Chin Banerjee. And I'm speaking to you tonight from the homeland of the Kalapuya peoples here in the Willamette Valley in Oregon. It's the land I'm sitting on. So I guess I'll just jump right in. I have a few PowerPoint slides that I will turn on intermittently, and I think I'm going to speak about 30 minutes, and then Gerardo is going to offer some comments. As Patrick Wolf has written, settler colonialism was foundational to modernity, and thus also to the form that economic development took in the wake of colonial expansions. Built on the logics of labor and resource extraction, development, in scare quotes, required the racialization and gendering of indigenous populations in Latin America and the enslavement of roughly 10,800,000 people from a broad range of ethnic groups from the African continent. Development in the service of colonialism created epistemological and social, economic, gender, and racial categories and inequalities that permeate our understandings of the world and that continue to justify genocide, feminicide, white supremacy, anti-Black and anti-Indigenous and other forms of racism. In my talk today, I want to center the ideas of feminist woman of color theorist, philosopher Maria Lugones, who has theorized the colonial modern gender system as a way to understand how coloniality, and I would argue settler colonialism, in an ongoing way, has produced race and gender historically. She suggests that the idea of gender is a colonial construction rooted in colonial processes. Lugones both builds on and criticizes Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano's writing on the coloniality of power and the social classification of the world by race. Using Lugones's model of the colonial modern gender system as a platform, I also am going to incorporate Indigenous women's ideas about life projects from specific women and specific groups from Mexico and Guatemala, looking at their models of spiritual, physical, and material health as examples of contemporary Indigenous women's projects that not only speak back to hegemonic models of development, but also provide alternative models that move us closer to what Arturo Escobar and others have called radical relationality, building connections between the body, the spirit, people, place, and the natural world as integrated entities and beings. Beginning with Lugones, she has theorized the colonial modern gender system as a way to help us understand how coloniality has produced both race and gender historically. She suggests that gender is a colonial construction, not a primordial universal division, and it's rooted in colonial processes. She argues that Quijano's view about the classification of the world population by race remains centered in patriarchal and heterosexual perspectives. His understanding of gender, she suggests, is grounded in global, Eurocentered capitalistic understandings of what gender is about. Instead, Lugones draws on the work of Indigenous, Afro-descendant, and other scholars such as Polygon Allen, Oyeronke Oyewumi, and others to explore how the colonial modern gender system is implicated in the construction of collective authority, all aspects of the relation between capital and labor, and the construction of knowledge. Put a different way, the coloniality of gender is with us. It is what lies at the intersection of gender, class, race, sexuality as central constructs of the capitalist world system of power. Historically, she says, quote, this gender system congeals as Europe advances the colonial projects. It begins to take shape during the Spanish and Portuguese colonial adventures and becomes full-blown in late modernity. The gender system has a light side and a dark side. The light side only orders the lives of white bourgeois men and women, and it constitutes the modern colonial meaning of men, quote unquote, and women, quote unquote. Sexual purity is a crucial characteristic of the white bourgeois females who reproduce the class and the colonial and racial standing of white bourgeois men. The dark side of the gender system was and is thoroughly violent. The dark side of the gender system eliminated animales, anafemales, and third genders from the system, as it was rooted in heterosexual patriarchy, and through categorizing indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans as not in the human species, often as animals, uncontrollably sexual and wild, essentially putting them outside of the gender system. The behaviors of the colonized and their personalities and their souls were judged as bestial and thus non-gendered, promiscuous, grotesquely sexual, and sinful. Lugones also suggested that we should not view the colonized person in accordance with the colonial imagination, but we should see them, quote, as a being who begins to inhabit a fractured locus, constructed doubly, perceiving doubly, relating doubly, where the sides of the locus are in tension, in conflict, and the conflict itself, its energy, moves actively and informs the subjectivity of the colonized self in multiple relations. To decolonize gender, she suggests that we bracket the gender distinction and optimize other logics of resistance. To do so, she proposes, along with some other people, a feminist border thinking, where the liminality of a border is a ground, a space, a borderlands, to use Gloria Anzaldua's term, not just a split, not an infinite repetition of dichotomous hierarchies among the desouled specters of the human. This kind of border thinking that Lugones suggests requires seeing how coloniality is sensed as concrete, intricately related exercises of power. Some of these are body to body, some are legal, some happen inside of a room, as indigenous female beasts, not civilized women, this is a quote from her, are forced to weave day and night. To engage in feminist border thinking, I think we also have to engage what Walter Manolo has called epistemic disobedience. If indigenous peoples, Afro-descendants, and other non-white races were viewed as non-human, then of course, violence against them was not seen as a crime against fellow humans. While this colonial inheritance might seem extreme, if we look at contemporary gendered violence in Guatemala, where I've been doing fieldwork for the past 5 years on gendered violence, and also in Mexico, we can see it's not such a stretch, or in the United States, or in Canada. Gendered violence, including brutal rape, genocide, and what would now be called feminicide, were a part of, for example, Guatemala's civil war. Such gendered violence didn't become visible until much later, despite the record that it was in the historical record, including in truth commissions. Much academic research documents how gendered violence was a tool of systemic, generalized terror. Mass rapes primarily carried out during invasions or massacres of villages and designed to make violence spectacular. Statistical analysis of Truth Commission reports suggest that 90% of the victims of sexual violence were Mayan, primarily Mayan indigenous women. More than 100,000 women have been reported raped during the Guatemala Civil War. But that does not mean that indigenous Guatemalan women are victims. They are survivors and organizers, and I will talk about that. These statistics underline the ways in which the lack of humanity attributed to Mayan women and other indigenous women in other places was fundamental to the logic that permitted them to be seen as non-human and therefore acceptable to rape, kill, and brutalize. Epistemological disobedience, indigenous and other tools for breaking with the modern colonial gender system. Radical relationality, as described by Arturo Escobar as, quote, the fact that all entities that make up the world are so deeply interrelated that they have no intrinsic separate existence by themselves, is a useful concept. Modern epistemology grants entities a separate existence, thanks to the foundational premises of separation between subject and object, mind and body, nature and humanity, reason and emotion, facts and values, and us and them, and so forth. That's a quote from Escobar. Escobar's discussion underlines the dichotomies, including gender, that Lugones suggests are central to colonial modernity. Argentinian anthropologist Rita Salgado suggests that patriarchal masculinist ontologies with their foundational binary matrix represent the expropriation of value and its subsequent domination, and continue to be at the basis of most forms of violence and predatory accumulation. Escobar and Salgado both suggest that radical relationality can be based on the relational and communal practices that still inhabit or perhaps have been recuperated in Afro-Latin American, indigenous peasants, and the urban marginal world. Escobar draws his lessons from his long engagement with his indigenous and Afro-descendant interlocutors. Mexican anthropologist Mariana Mora works from a similar position with a specific lens on gender, and mining the insights of indigenous and Afro-descendant activists for feminist theory and the politics of allyship. What happens when we see feminine and other bodies as inseparable from the collective bodies of a community of people or a territory? Modernist development is subjected to the interrelated spheres of indigenous bodies, community, nations, and territories to dispossession, extraction, and occupation. Indigenous women and men from a wide range of ethnic groups and peoples advocate that we look at them as connected, interrelated, and inseparable. What if we look at violence against women as intimately related to the violation of indigenous territories? And what if the solutions to gendered and other violences are rooted in collective restorative justice in projects of life instead of projects of death? Let's explore these questions through different women's perspective, indigenous women's perspective on gendered and other forms of violence. Okay, here is where I'm going to share my screen. Some indigenous women's groups say gendered violence is a collective problem that needs collective solutions. Such is the position of Marichuy from the Consejo Indígena de Gobierno de la CNI, the Consejo Nacional Indígena. Marichuy was put forward as a presidential candidate in 2017. Marichuy almost gathered the 900,000 signatures required to be on the ballot as an official presidential candidate. Marichuy and others speak of the relationship between extreme gendered physical violence, including against female bodies, and structural violence. In a speech given in December of 2017 in Ciudad Nezahualcóyotl, a place where indigenous peoples have migrated from all over Mexico, Marichuy focused on violence against indigenous women as crimes, not just against individual women, but also as crimes against the collective bodies of indigenous peoples. She said, this is my translation, when a woman is raped, disappeared, imprisoned, or murdered, it's as if the entire community, the neighborhood, the town, or the family had been raped, disappeared, imprisoned, or murdered. These acts seek, in the midst of that mourning and fear, to colonize and pervert the fabric that is there in our collective heart, to take over everything that we are and turn it into a commodity that they need for the insatiable accumulation of money and power. So threatening the lives of women against their integrity, their dignity, and their rights is an attempt against life itself. And for a people, a nation, it is deeply self-destructive, since the sacred collective that we imagine, exercise, and fight for is what we fundamentally defend in this struggle as indigenous women. Silence, fear, machismo, and capitalist patriarchy are the hatred of the powerful against life. Here, Marichuy points out that violence against one indigenous woman is violence against an entire community and against the many collective institutions communities share. This can include territory, human histories lived and etched into that territory, collective institutions of justice and governance. So simply sending the abuser to prison is not sufficient. Gendered violence calls for punishment that both implicates the community and the offender and tries to heal them. I'll return to that in a few minutes. Other indigenous leaders from the CNI have developed an analytical framework that we can call projects of death versus projects of life. caught up in multiple forms of dispossession in their territories, water, land, plants, and animals, and dispossession due to agro-industrial projects, hydroelectric dams, wind farms, and mining. Dispossession is carried out not only by multinational businesses, but also by what indigenous people are calling narco-paramilitaries, organized crime that occupies indigenous land. It's very prevalent in Mexico and Guatemala. The claiming and protection of the territory, the land, the water force, and all form of life found within them are viewed in parallel to the importance of claiming the right of women to be free from gendered violence against their bodies. The individual body, the social body, and the territorial body are conceptualized as interconnected and mutually constituted. Let's see if I can move this a little bit. In the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, Mexico, Zapotec activist Bettina Cruz clearly lays out the interrelationship between the social body and territory. She is the founder of the Asamblea de Pueblos Indígenas del Istmo de Tehuantepec en Defensa de la Tierra y Territorio, an organization created to stop a wind energy project sponsored by several Spanish companies. There are now more than 25 wind energy parks across the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. Bettina is from Santa Maria Xandani. That is the name of her county or municipality. She's also a member of the movement of civil resistance against high electricity prices. She survived ongoing death threats and faces just constant intimidation for her work. There's a quote from her: "They want to occupy the water, the land, the mountain, and have us as laborers. They want to kill us because they despise our life as indigenous peoples, who we are, and our culture." In Sonora, activist and CNI councilor Mirna Dolores Valencia Banda, who is Yoremi from Coahuirimpo, has focused on protecting water and land. Water and land inside of what has become an ever-diminishing Yoremi territory remains central to life projects. Agro-industrial development, the use of chemicals, and monocropping had depleted the soil and contaminated local water sources. And the quote that I'm going to read: "Mirna links human life with the life of the land and the water," again, linking the human body, the social body, and the planetary body. The land means just that, our own existence, our own life. For us, the most important thing for us is life, because together with us, there is a whole culture, a whole universe. Sadly, these people who dispossess our land, what is done to our properties, this is supported by the government system. This region is where the most contaminated water is due to agro consumption and use of pesticides, chemical fertilizers. We can see it here in our river. It's impossible. The water that is life can give us life. On the contrary, that water now means death. In the Department of Huehuetenango, Guatemala, where I've been doing field work for the past 5 summers, but not this past one, leaders in the Defensoría de la Mujer Indígena, known as DEMI, have integrated practices of Mayan spirituality in their organizing, legal services, social services, and events, serving a broad range of indigenous women from Mang, Aguateco, Acateco, Chuk, Popti, and Canjobal ethnic groups. Indigenous DEMI promotoras, social workers, lawyers, and staff work with women's groups throughout the Departamento of Huehuetenango. They also offer legal and social services to hundreds of women through their offices, which have been closed until 2 weeks ago. They just opened up for one-on-one. DEMI Indigenous lawyers offer legal support to women who are survivors of different kinds of violence, are attempting to get child support from estranged spouses, and more. The main office in Huehuetenango has a large conference room with a Mayan altar set up at one end. DEMI staff meetings, individual or group consultations, and large gatherings or events like the one in this slide begin with a healing ceremony involving flowers, the cardinal directions, sacred smoke, and other ritual elements. All group events begin with a healing and thanksgiving ceremony to the earth. Such an approach brings women together at the beginning of any activity And though they may be talking about their individual experiences, such as domestic violence, they're doing so in a collective event where all participants are connected to one another in the moment, but also to the larger planet, natural forces, and ancestors. Being planted on the earth together, connected to each other, and the past, present, and future grounds them collectively. In an event leading up to International Indigenous Women's Day, a transnational group of Indigenous women's organizations created a series of encuentros or encounters for Indigenous women. Titled Cura da Terra, the encuentros brought women together to examine the interlinked questions of healing and protecting the earth, Indigenous territories, Indigenous bodies, and Indigenous spirits. The framework, like the worldviews of the Indigenous Council women that I talked about in Mexico, links capitalist expansion, dispossession of land, forced displacement by violence, structural violence, and violence to women's bodies and those of their mothers and grandmothers, brings all of these things together. Their perspective also analyzes religious fundamentalism and the extinction of the saberes, or the knowledges of their mothers and grandmothers. This event offers Indigenous women a collectively digital streamed event to heal themselves with others. Events such as Cura da Terra and the Demi Mayan healing ceremonies can help Indigenous women connect and begin healing processes. But what kinds of ongoing models exist in Indigenous communities for addressing violence against women in collective frameworks? Alternative Indigenous systems of justice and governance offer some tools for how to do this in a way that could offer alternatives to how feminicide and gender violence are understood and resolved in communities. The Policía Comunitaria, the communitary police, was founded in 1995 in Santa Cruz del Rincón in the municipality of Malinaltepec, Guerrero. 3 years later, in 1998, the Coordinadora Regional de Autoridades Indígenas, known as the CRAC, or later renamed as the Coordinadora Regional de Autoridades Comunitarios, was formed in San Luis, Acatlan. The organization was born in a regional assembly where citizens decided that in addition to taking control of their own security, they also needed to take on the task of administering justice to those who were found guilty of crimes. The challenge of organizing a justice system that worked in parallel with the structure of community policing required a system of punishment and readaptation. Inspired by community models of reconciliation and agreement through long processes of discussion and mediation, the CRAC decided that they needed to emphasize collective work for the community as a basis for punishment and social reintegration. They called this community re-education. Women have been involved in this justice system, and it offers new insights into ways of framing and achieving justice for gendered violence. Mexican anthropologist Maria Teresa Sierra has long accompanied the CRAC with a special focus on collaboration with Indigenous women justice defenders. I guess that's my translation. She writes, shared individual and collective daily grievances have allowed women to name gender violence and articulate their own project as justice defenders. At the intersection of a set of structural vulnerabilities and precariousness, women justice defenders construct a life project and generate alternatives to defend women's integrity and shake patriarchal authority. In the end, it is their own condition as Indigenous women anchored in their local communities that allows them to place themselves on the same level of interlocution as women victims and survivors, close quote. Women who are justice defenders have been involved in organizing community assemblies, re-education, and reintegration for crimes such as rape and assault. But frankly, these women have also struggled within the structure of the CRAC to receive support from men for their work, and in particular for punishments for men who commit violence against women. When women who worked within the structure of the CRAC were also a part of the Indigenous Women's Center, or CAMI, which is pictured here, in San Luis, Acatlan, when they protested the release of a man by the CRAC who had been accused of rape of a minor girl, and for whom the women of Cami felt there was more than sufficient evidence of rape, they received threats and a withdrawal of protection from the crack, from the larger organization. In this instance, they towed the fine line between trying to continue to support autonomous indigenous structures of justice and working within those structures to push them to take seriously gendered violence. In this context, the right for all women to maintain control of and respect for the integrity and health of their bodies must be understood as a collective right. They have persevered, however, and continue their work at the local level, despite greatly reduced funding for this commie and the other ones across the country by the current Mexican government. In the Koch system of justice, the set of relationships which frame the crime is linked not only to larger structures implicated in the violence, but also to the relationships of healing in community, family, and neighborhood. The type of legal process is being experimented with by women justice defenders of the CRAC, by Zapatista-inspired women, such as Mari Chui, and the women counselors of the CNAE, suggests that there is an exit from the modern colonial gender system, an exit that is rooted in radical relationality. While we are a long way from being able to implement new models of how we understand, confront, and eliminate feminicide and other forms of gendered violence, these alternative models can provide hope for modifying legal and policing systems that can be inaccessible for many and problematic for those who go through them. At a larger level, these Indigenous women are giving us a roadmap for decolonizing development through life projects, linking our bodies to each other and to all the living things on our planet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynn, for a very informative and thoughtful paper. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you, Lynn.
We'll now hear from Gerardo Otero from International Studies at SFU. Gerardo is a professor in the School for International Studies and an associated faculty member of the Labor Studies program. In Vancouver, Otero is a founding member of the British Columbia Employment Standards Coalition and a research associate at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Take it away, Gerardo.
Okay, thank you very much, Lynn. What I'm going to do is, after hearing this wonderful micro-sociology of radical interrelationality, I'm going to zoom out and provide some, I guess, supplementary concepts to understand, how all these women from several regions, from Mexico and from Guatemala, articulate a very similar kind of cosmovision of the collective. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm probably going to read my paper, but if I share my screen, you will be able to see the main highlights of the paper. And I mean, the main point, I guess, that I want to focus on from Lynn's presentation is that violence and aggression against members of people from indigenous communities is simultaneously an aggression and violence to their communities themselves. So Lynn provided the ethnographic evidence, from all of these regions, and I'm going to resort to three social theorists, including Arturo Escobar, who was also cited by Lynn, who argues that violence is not only endemic, but also it is also constitutive of development. So this has definitely a lineage from, I guess, Marx's theorization of primitive accumulation, which Marx also saw as constitutive of capitalism. So displacement becomes a key feature of modernity. And So modernity has also led to the rationalization of culture and the principle of individuality as opposed to the collective. So one way of trying to go beyond human rights, because the whole notion of human rights is predicated on the individual, with individual rights and individual duties. So Boaventura de Sousa Santos, who is the other theorist that I'm going to be using, one of the others, he expands the concept of human rights to encompass the Islamic concept of ummah, or community, and the Hindu concept of dharma, or cosmic harmony, which involves all humans and other beings. So that would get us away from this exclusive focus on individuals and try to integrate us to become part of our collectivities, our communities. So moving to the dominant side of things, and here I'm drawing from Immanuel Wallerstein, in his exploration of the development of the concept of development. He points to three main causes for leading in the Western world as imperial powers. In other words, what makes for leading in or becoming an empire? Well, he points to these three items: Industrial Revolution, the Bourgeois Revolution, and individual freedom. It is the latter point, individual freedom, that is relevant to our conversation today, that the notion of individuals became inextricable from Western thought. When extended to territories in the 20th century, the Wilsonian self-determination principle was made equivalent to that of individual freedom. So it assumed that both states and individuals were equivalent in being capable of making rational choices according to self-interest. So for Woodrow Wilson, self-determination was to be applied to the Ottoman, the Russian, the Austro-Hungarian empires. Eventually, Franklin Roosevelt referred to liberating the colonies of the French, the Dutch, and the British. It was all about granting self-determination to the peripheries and the semi-peripheries of the world system, which enabled the United States to, well, there's some grammatical problems here, sorry about that. But this decolonization enabled the United States to dominate the world economically. So both Wilsonianism and Leninism advocated decolonization via self-determination and seem to have the same rods to measure legitimacy. However, they had different roads to self-determination. Wilsonianism supported constitutional roads, or octroyer, I'm not sure how you pronounce that in French, but that would mean granted or given from above, the self-determination. And that would be as opposed to Leninism, which favored armed revolution, or arraqué, or snatched or taken from below, the self-determination. So from, okay, hold on. From 1971 to 1989, Immanuel Wallerstein says that he can say both the elegy and the requiem for developmentalism. There was a triumph of self-determination, decolonization, and the construction of the interstate system with formal institutions of the state. Decolonization was partly granted and partly snatched, as seen here. But Wallerstein rightly predicted that the triumph was not for Leninism, but for Wilsonianism in the form of neoliberalism. But he also predicted its own viability, starting with the failure of the first Gulf War. So one question is, how can people and communities defend themselves from modernity? And here I'm relying once again on Arturo Escobar, who says that, well, we have to build on people's struggles to remain in place and in their own cultures, fostering people's autonomy over their territory and their culture. And in all of this, food security is quite central. So perhaps the main contrast between Wallerstein and Escobar is how each of them regards the members of their discipline about praxis. Wallerstein is a sociologist, Escobar is an anthropologist. So for Wallerstein, he considers praxis as the involvement with social movements as fundamental. For Arturo Escobar, however, he sees anthropological practice as riddled with ethical issues because it almost always is involved with bureaucracies. So the question is, whose side will anthropologists be on? And I'm going to leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Gerardo. It's given us a lot to think about. Now I'd like to say to everybody who's watching, if you would like to send in questions, either through the Q&A or on the chat line, I think I can manage them both. I don't really see why there's a reason to prefer one over the other, but they're both there. So I'll watch out for that.
It might be easier to manage if it comes only in one way, maybe just through the chat. I'm saying because I've already been moderator in another event where there were questions through both, and it's a little messy.
Okay, well, let's take the suggestion to use the chat. Whether that will actually change events, of course, is another thing we'll have to wait and see. But I will anyway invite anybody to ask questions at the moment. And let me just perhaps begin with an observation while we're waiting for that, which I think pertains perhaps to both of the papers. I see not so much a specific question, but an issue that seemed to be going on in both of the papers. One is the relationship between indigenous nations and practices and cultures, which of course are a very long-standing historical time, and then the whole question of states, sometimes called nation states these days, though they're not really nation states. They're if I take a nation to mean a people, the indigenous peoples are nations, and perhaps some of the old European peoples are also nations, but the states that we now deal with are not nation states, they're states. And Gerardo gave a history of how there has been in the 20th century a movement towards the independence of nation states, but in many ways, paradoxically, or maybe it's not paradoxically, but at least as a reverse development, it's become very difficult for indigenous nations within those states. It's not entirely clear, for example, that the independence of Canada from the British Empire has helped the position of the indigenous people within the country. So I see both of you as working in some way with these two factors that are going on. And I wonder if you have some comment on that.
Well, I think we also have to look at words like sovereignty, autonomy, and I think there's been a lot of really interesting work on settler colonialism, including looking at the model of settler colonialism that really was developed, to explain Canada, the US, First Nations, and looking at it in Latin America, and looking how those processes have happened maybe in different ways with somewhat different details, but sort of the insights that settler colonialism is about elimination of Native peoples, not necessarily genocide, but elimination in a lot of different ways, and sort of occupation and replication of settler society. So I think there's a lot of interesting work to sort of look at those processes that actually decenters states in some ways, and looks at the specificities, in particular historical periods, and also recenters the ideas about Indigenous sovereignty and autonomy. And of course, the way that we talk about Indigenous peoples or pueblos or nations in Mexico or Guatemala is somewhat different, because of what happened in both countries in the 1800s and the way that, tribes are recognized or not recognized in the United States, and the way that First Nation politics works in Canada. So I actually think that looking at really recent work on, people who've been using the concept of settler colonialism in Latin America, comparatively, people like Shannon Speed at UCLA, who has just published a new book that really develops the concept, and some other people, sort of recenters Native nations and sovereignty and autonomy in this discussion. And I think that's really necessary and takes us away from Western, male theorists, systems theorists, and brings in, other kinds of possibilities. So, and the question of gender, and the historicity of gender and how that works, and what's happened with gender and the development of gender and race in settler colonialism also gets recentered, because those things tend to drop out in those larger analysis. And it's very difficult, I think, if we just take Mexico, for example, there are different ways that people are asserting sovereignty or trying to assert autonomy and sovereignty in different kinds of conditions. So in fact, the actors, for example, if you look at the Indigenous women that I commented on, it's not, the government is an actor, the state, if you want to call it that, but there are other very powerful actors like organized crime, who are extracting all kinds of things, from Indigenous land. It could be lumber, it could be oil, it could be many different things. And the convergence of states with organized crime, with militaries or paramilitaries, really, creates a very complex context for the struggles for sovereignty and autonomy now. So I think we have to also sort of look at those multi-criminal, organizations and the relationships between states and global organized crime and extraction, and then the militarized and paramilitarized entities that protect those integrated kinds of interests. So that's what people are sort of trying to push back against. It's a complex, difficult situation, not to mention what the pandemic does to all of that.
Yeah, I just would comment that, in this whole issue of indigenous peoples or nations, I think it varies a lot throughout the Americas, how the struggles try to constitute themselves, whether it's as indigenous peoples or as nations. For instance, in Ecuador, the main struggle of indigenous peoples was to for the recognition of plurinationality. However, I would clarify that in this notion of nationality, there is no such a thing as seeking independence from the state, or secession. They do seek autonomy from the state, but they don't want to have their own ambassadors in different countries and so on and so forth. Which is why, I happen to think that the main struggle has been for what I called in an article, expanding national borders from within, for the recognition of indigenous peoples and their rights, and actually implementing, some of the conventions that have been signed by Mexico in this case, the convention, the ILO convention of 189 convention on indigenous peoples. And with regard to Canada, I saw a very interesting article the other day about the need to get rid of the Queen if we want to really move forward with decolonization. Well, we need to start getting rid of the Queen.
Okay.
Well, I'll certainly second that.
Sure.
Yes, I've got a couple of questions have come in. So this is a question from Donna Clark to all the panelists, though it's actually directed to Lynn. Can you talk a little bit about how white liberal feminism goes wrong in understanding the indigenous communities that you work with?
Okay. There are many feminisms, and certainly I guess you have an understanding of white liberal feminism. Maybe I do. But there, particularly in Latin America, there have been indigenous feminisms, indigenous ways of thinking. So I think some of the, sort of pieces of the roadmap that I laid out, like collective rights, being at the crossroad, but of collective rights, of not separating individual bodies into individual rights. I think that's and tying gender and gendered rights to collective rights is probably one of the baseline characteristics that I would say I've learned through working with indigenous women over the past 30 years in a variety of different countries. Race or an anti-racist stance is fundamental. And then also notions of sovereignty and autonomy. Those are all interrelated. And usually in looking at the way that indigenous women narrate their experience, the way they participate in movements, you could see it in the examples that I tried to give, that land, individual bodies, territory, collective rights, those are all interrelated. So you cannot hive off gender rights or women's rights as one entity without seeing them connected to that. And that was one of the, sort of basic lessons that Zapatista women gave to us now 26 years ago. So I think there are many different feminisms, and there's been, fortunately, a lot of good work done in illuminating feminist, insights from Black feminists from the 1960s and the 1970s, indigenous feminists too, not just in Mexico, but other places. So I think in the academy now, at least in the women's gender and sexuality studies departments I'm familiar with, there has been a real decentering of, sort of one liberal narrative for feminism. And that's entirely welcome. And now indigenous feminists are, they're writing their own theory. And they're, as I'm trying to argue, they're bringing theory to those of us who are non-indigenous and those of us who consider ourselves feminists and who want to be allies. So thank you for the question.
Yes, we have a question here from Danielle Gallardo to, first I've skipped one. There's a statement here from Sid Schneid. I take it's a bit more of a statement than a question, but perhaps you want to respond in some fashion. He says, having watched developments here in Canada and beyond, our task appears to be the mounting of a common joint struggle against capitalism in order to rescue both the Indigenous peoples struggling against development and the impact of the economic depression that has encompassed the world with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on people who have been integrated into the system as workers.
Yes, I'll just do a brief comment here. I think, since the 1990s, there's been a debate in the left as to whether, given the globalization of capital accumulation or capital accumulation now taking place on a global scale, there seems to be, and a lot of people argued for the need for a transnational globalism or constructing, a transnational civil society. I have argued against that with this concept of internationalist nationalism. I better explain what I mean by that, because nationalism, I think, has acquired, the status of a dirty word, more or less, because the most prominent type of nationalism that has emerged in the last few years has been right-wing xenophobic type of rationalism, which is why I label the type I think we could advocate as internationalist nationalism. Why that? Well, because I think at least until Donald Trump came to power in the United States, capital had already won the struggle on the global stage. The US state controlled the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, now by making it not work. So I thought it was very unviable to try to build a transnational global civil society. So my argument was that we need to build on localities, from the bottom up, and to recover the nation state with a popular democratic kind of program. So I'm going to leave it at that.
Okay, here's another question. This is the one that I started before from Danielle Gallardo for Dr. Lynn Stephen. By speaking of gender as a colonial construction, mainly through your work through women, can you speak if you have any experiences or perspectives of the violence and struggle of Indigenous LGBTQ plus people, particularly in Mexico?
Sure, thank you for the question. I just also wanted to respond to the previous question just with a statement.
My apologies.
Oh, that's okay. I don't think that we are going to rescue Indigenous people's struggle against development. I think they're going to rescue the rest of us who are not Indigenous. Really good question. One of the things that's really interesting, I think, about Maria Lugones's ideas is that essentially, if you don't have gender, you don't have sexuality, you don't have identities. Contemporary LGBTQ identities or any idea about sexuality as an identity that permeates a being is very recent, from, let's say, the mid to the late 1800s. There's plenty of evidence in ethno-historical records and even in Indigenous languages that there were many different kinds of behaviors and partnerships in Indigenous societies that we might mistakenly today call LGBTQ, right? They meant something different at the time. If sexuality is not an organizing principle of society, and if gender is not the primary organizing principle that it has become, then the way that Indigenous peoples and Indigenous states organize themselves, and wouldn't come out, with the same kind of labels that we have. But one of the products of settler colonialism, of colonialism, obviously is the disciplining and the terrorizing of indigenous peoples according to what we could call, Catholic coloniality. I have a wonderful colleague, Dr. Ana Marina Lara, who is just publishing a couple of books and has developed this concept of Christian coloniality in relation to the Caribbean, in relation to Afro-descendant and indigenous peoples, and how that really gets sort of imported into Spanish colonialism, and then it actually gets imported into the modern nation state in terms of the policing of bodies and the normalization of heterosexual, reproduction and sort of biblical male and female roles. So if we look at that sort of disciplining of bodies as according to Christian coloniality, then that's where we begin to see the production of violence against bodies that behave differently, join together outside of those new moralities. So one of the things that was fascinating to me, I have had a long association with the Zapotec community in Oaxaca, and I speak Zapotec. I lived in this community for several years and returned almost every year for a very long time. And one of the things I began to see through the Zapotec language after a period of time were labels for, let's say, people who had sexual relationships with men. Maybe they were also married to women, and women with women, or it was fairly flexible. And they were entirely different words in Zapotec, not the Isthmus Zapotec where people talk about mouche, which is very well known, but which suggests, back through time in the Zapotec language, there were words for people who had these proclivities or did these things, but it didn't entirely define them. So certainly many people would argue that the kind of punishment and terror that has been visited on indigenous peoples who today would claim the identity of trans or LGBTQ, is definitely rooted in coloniality, and it gets imported, into contemporary social values. And in a country like Mexico, it's a highly complex country. Mexico City, abortion is legal, gay marriage is legal in Mexico City, but there's also tremendous violence against LGBTQ and trans people in Mexico City, and some of them are indigenous. There's been interesting sort of coalition building between indigenous peoples or indigenous people who identify maybe as LGBTQ or as another label. So it's something that I have personal experience with, but I haven't really done, I haven't done research recently on those movements. But there's a lot of really interesting work out there. And I think it's a really important topic. Thank you for asking about it.
Perhaps I could just ask a little supplementary on that, because I was struck by the way you described the traditional practices there of people engaging in different kinds of activities, but not being defined by them. And I wonder if that, do you see a certain relationship or sympathy with people who've argued often and often because of the influence of Michel Foucault, that the problem is the connection of sexual practices with identities, and that it's really a question of what people do is the question.
Well, Foucault does a beautiful job of developing the story of the deployment of sexuality, right? And at one point, he talks about bodies and pleasures. So he really, that's what Foucault specializes in, is sort of an archaeology of knowledge and really tracing where the labeling of those bodies and the totalizing, you could talk about this in terms of any identity, but where what was, labeled as a behavior becomes an identity, and then it becomes a stigmatization, and then there are laws and punishments in legal institutions. But we can, we have to look at colonialism and settler colonialism, I would argue, in the sense that those are ongoing processes. I mean, what's interesting now in at least the US is, sort of the reclaiming of these identities among Native peoples in certain tribes, of third genders or natals, or, I mean, there's a whole lot of different linguistic categories, and then there's French and there's Spanish, and there are all these other labels that were imposed on folks. But there are records in the United States of there being 5 genders or 7 genders or 12 genders, because if you take what we package as a bifurcated gender into male and female, it's like a lot of different characteristics, and there's no reason why you can't put it into 6 packages or no packages. Those are all, historical questions. And I think Foucault helps us understand, in some ways how that happened, certainly, in Europe.
Indeed. Here's a comment or another question from Sid Schneid, coming to Gerardo's comment about ending the monarchy's influence in Canada, remarking that Indigenous people have successfully utilized the treaties that the Crown made with particular Indigenous groups against the Canadian state and its developmental priorities. This, to some extent, overlaps with the question I threw out at the beginning. Settler states have quite often, I have a particular antipathy for the monarchy, but settler states, quite often the Crown made agreements with Indigenous groups in Canada and other places back when Indigenous groups were much stronger and the Crown had to make agreements. And those still have some force of law. So, yeah, what about that, Gerardo?
I was hoping Sid Schneid might be able to illuminate us on that. So I wasn't sure, from his question, whether he was arguing that Indigenous people would be more or less protected by having these treaties than they might be, for instance, in the United States.
Well, I don't think we can ask Sid to. He's written now. He's arguing that monarchy is not the problem.
Oh.
But there are some. Now this is not my field, so I'm gonna get this slightly wrong probably. But there are some people on the Indigenous side who argue that the treaties made with the Crown that go back to, I think it's 1715, and that allow them certain disposition over their lands, that these treaties are still in force. And that the problem is that the Canadian state, through its settler colonial independence, has tried to extinguish them. So I'm sure I get the dates wrong. I always get dates wrong, but I believe that's the kind of thing he's alluding to.
But we don't have a queen. I think we have someone who thinks he's king. But I think those treaties are really interesting. And now, in the US, we have cadres of Native lawyers, who are going back to court and bringing these treaties back. And we just had a recent recognition of a significant piece of Oklahoma as Indigenous territory. So these, and Oregon as well. It's, this is an ongoing process, just like, settler colonialism is an ongoing process. Resistance to it is also ongoing. So those treaties can, they're still very much in people's minds, and people are working on them and, working in the system, working out of the system, but interesting to think about how they stay with us.
We have another. from Gerardo Otero. So is that you, Gerardo, or somebody?
Yep.
So, okay, I'll read your question. It says, question for Lynn. What do you make of the new designations he, him, his, or she, her, hers, etc.?
I mean, this is in relation to what Ian had asked about people becoming designated for their activities. And now I see a trend since a couple of years, I guess, ago. I went to a conference, and below my name tag, it said he, him, his. And I was wondering, well, what is this? And now I see that a lot of people sign, by they, them, or she, her, hers. I mean, so what do you make of it from a gender perspective?
Well, I mean, it comes from the trans movement and from the importance of not assuming what people's gender is and letting people self-designate. So it's very customary, I think, particularly in the academy, for people to introduce them and for them to share what their preferred pronouns are. Some people put those on their email too. So it's about not assuming gender identity, about creating space for people who are non-binary, who, do not want to be labeled or want to be called they or theirs, because they, that's what they're signaling with their body. I mean, there could be a proliferation of different terms, but basically I think it's about freedom to self-define your gender or not to define a gender. That's how I understand it. Maybe there may be, more insight from people who are like 16 to, 30, where that's been very much a part of their socialization.
If I could just make a quick remark on this. I mean, this is a very interesting development that's come up more recently, and one can see, I think, the way in which it's a liberating thing for people who've been pushed into straitjackets that they're not at all comfortable with. But on the other hand, to me, I hear a little bit of everyone defines themselves for themselves in this, and it really, I wonder how that sits with the whole issue of relationality and the fact that our identities really are not ours in that way. They're in our relations with others. And I've wondered, I have no solution to this. I've just wondered about it in hearing this recently. Also with the same kind of thing comes to my mind when I hear people say things like, state your prejudices or your biases up front. I mean, if we all were aware of our biases and our prejudices, we would be very different people than we are. And it assumes, again, this subject that is completely separated from all these interactions we enter into. Anyway, it's perhaps just a bit of an editorial on my part. Sid Schneid here has remarked again on the same point as before, I think, that Andrew Jackson ignored the US Supreme Court decision in favor of the Cherokees. He said that he would not enforce this decision and that he would leave it to the Chief Justice to do that, effectively denying the decision and the rule of law, which is, I suppose, in a strange sense, comforting to know that the violation of the rule of law is not just a recent event, but it's been going on for a very long time. Okay, I was just checking the Q&A thing, but there's nothing there. Do you have any questions you want to raise about each other's talks? We've only got about 8 minutes left, so if there's anything you feel you want to say, this would be the time to do it.
Well, I just have a quick question for Lynn. I mean, you mentioned that Shannon Speed is now at UCLA. She used to be at the University of Texas at Austin. And I mean, I guess my question is, do you notice any specific differences in Shannon's theorizing by her being Native American, in contrast to the kind of theorizing about indigeneity that you see in Latin America?
I guess
Is
I'm
there
trying
a
to.
standpoint
Well,
difference?
of course there is. Yes, we all have, standpoints. I think, I'm trying to see if I have a copy of Shannon's book here, but, she first did her work with Zapatista women in Chiapas, and really was one of the first people to sort of publish and articulate in English about the importance of, of collective rights and how that's conceptualized and related to concepts of dignity and other kinds of concepts. She then went to Texas and she did work in the Hutto Detention Center, which is where detained, people coming over the border were. And she worked with a series of women, primarily indigenous, primarily from Guatemala, who shared their stories with her there. So her analysis about applying settler colonialism to Latin America, I think actually comes out of that, experience of working with these Guatemalan women and then looking at what happens to them, not only in Guatemala, in Mexico, but what happens in detention and the whole centrality of caging of indigenous people. There's another really interesting book called City of Inmates by African-American historian Kelly Lytle Hernandez, who's also at UCLA. There's a great, amazing group of women there that I've had the pleasure of interacting with a number of times. And she writes a book about the LA jail, but the Los Angeles jail, the very first jail, was actually built by the Spanish to jail Native people, right? So the notion of incarceration and the way that incarceration as a form of elimination of Native peoples, works historically, but it's still working today. Because when you go I worked 2 years ago, I was on sabbatical in San Diego, and I worked at a shelter in San Diego for families who were picked up by ICE, put into detention. And a majority of the Guatemalans there were indigenous. There were a lot of indigenous women and kids. So that I think the sort of threading the history of detention and these different histories in these populations. And then now these folks are in the US and what's happening to them there. I think that brings that together. Shannon Speed is Chickasaw, and she also has done a lot of work on Chickasaw tribal courts and systems of governance. So, she really is working in sort of multiple perspectives, and she's also the director of the American Indian Studies Center at UCLA. So she, is involved in indigenous politics in Los Angeles and a lot of different places. So, I think, we all evolve through time, and I just, I see her work as really pioneering and important. That's why I mentioned it.
Great. Thank you very much.
We're very close to the end, and we're just 4 minutes to go, and I have no more questions here. So I think I'm going to call an end to the discussion, which has been extremely interesting, and I've been writing down lots of notes while I've been listening. So thank you very much, Dr. Lynn Stephen from the University of Oregon. Wonderful talk. And to Dr. Gerardo Otero, School of International Studies at SFU. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you both.
Thanks everybody for
participating.